So today I'm going to talk about Flask, which is a Python web development framework. So for your reference here, I have the Flask website open up, which gives you tutorials, documents, talks about extensions, sort of gives you a full overview of what Flask can do for you. My goal with the video today is to teach you how to set up Flask, to show you what it is and what it can do, and then just run through how you might go about creating sort of your first application with Flask. In order to follow along with this tutorial, I'm going to assume that you've seen my videos on setting up Python 3.7, as well as setting up the virtual environment for Python 3.7. And so if you've seen those, you can sort of jump right in. What I'm going to do first is just open up my text editor here, right? So I'm working in Visual Studio Code. And first thing that I'm going to do is open up my bash terminal, because I want to create a virtual environment that I'm going to use for this tutorial. So I'm going to run Python 3.7 -m venv, and then I'm just going to call this flask-tutorial, and we'll run that, which will install my virtual environment. With this installed, what I'm going to do is just make a directory here, and I'm just going to call it Flask, and I'm going to actually activate my virtual environment as well. So I'll run source flask-tutorial bin activate, and that will put us into this Flask tutorial virtual environment here. I'm going to change directory into my Flask directory just so that we're working from the right place to begin. And now what I'm going to do is actually install Flask. So in order to do that, easiest way is just going to be to run pip install Flask. Now that that's installed, we can create a new file here. I'm just going to call it main.py. There we go. Open it up. I'll close my terminal for now. And we're going to first import Flask. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say from Flask, which is the package, import, and then capital F Flask. Now this is just going to import sort of the base library, let us set up the application, see how it runs, and then we can go from there. So the first thing that you need to do in general when working with your application here is to actually define your app object. So we'll go app equals Flask, and then we provided this underscore name. Now if you've not done too much Python programming, this might be a little bit confusing for you. So to be clear, there are two underscores. We type name, two more underscores. This is essentially going to give us the access point to our application here. So don't worry too much about what this is saying. Right now, we just want to get the app set up and running, and then we can start playing around with the features it offers. Now what I'm going to do is type the @ symbol, and then I'm going to go app.root. And I'm going to provide a URL here. So all I'm going to do is just provide a /, so sort of the root URL on a website. Then I'm going to come under this and define a function. So I'm just going to define the function hello world. I'm not going to give it any parameters. And all I want to do here is return the string hello world. Okay, so we have a pretty simple 7-line Python script here. And this is going to be sort of the bare bones Flask application that you can run. I'll come explain what everything is happening here. But first, we need to figure out how we're actually going to get this thing to run. So I'm going to open up my terminal again, and then I'm going to type two commands. So the first is going to be export Flask app, all in capitals, equals, and then the name of our file here. So that's going to be main.py. Then I'm also going to type export, and I'm going to type flask_env, and I'm going to type development. Now this second command here is just specifying that we're using a development environment for Flask, and so that's going to give us a lot of useful debugging tools. Now these two commands are enough so that when we type Flask run, what we're going to do is actually start up our Flask application. So you can see that we're serving Flask app main.py. So if I control click this and then open up my web browser here, you can see that I'll zoom in on this. We have that URL running, and then we get this hello world string return. So just to clarify that this is actually working, if I come back in here and I return hello world, how are you? Come back, refresh, you can see we're getting that string. So what's actually happening here is that we've started up this web server and we've provided it a root. So the root is going to be whatever we type into our URL on top of our base URL. And when we reach this root, the Flask app is going to run the function that we define below it. So in this case, we're running this hello world function, and all it does is return a string. And so all that's going to happen is that string is going to get returned, and then Flask knows that when you're returning just a string, you can display that in the browser directly. We could come down here and we could go app.root, and let's just specify /about. Now we're going to define about as a function. These functions can be all called anything you'd like. They just can't conflict with one another. And then we'll return, again, we'll just return another string, and we'll just say it's the about page. Okay, so we've refreshed that. Come back over here, and if I now browse to /about, you can see that we get the about page. So when we hit this root, /about, we run this about function, and we're returning the string here. So that's all well and good, but obviously by itself, that's not going to be super useful. We can start trying to include variables into our roots here. So let's say that I have a root and I say user, and then essentially I want to respond to provide a profile page for a specific user, for instance. And maybe I want it so that the root is user, and then somewhere in here we want to have the username. We can do it, and we can actually do it exactly like this. So what you do is you specify whatever the static root is that you want here, and then inside of these angled brackets, you specify whatever the variable name is. Now, when you define a function here, so I'm just going to call this user profile, you need to make sure that you pass in whatever you've specified in the URL here as the variable within that profile, or as the parameter. And now what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to return, I'm going to use a Python 3 f string here, and I'm just going to say welcome, and then I'll type in the username here. So now if I go back here and I browse to user / say partially developed, you can see welcome partially developed, right? And if I change this to Bib or Bob, and you can see that's responding here. So this is responding to the variable. Now, interestingly, if you type user and you don't provide anything, then you can see that this root is not actually found, and that's because it expects there to be something there. So just, keep that in mind when we're defining these roots. You can obviously think about playing around with this, and you could get quite far just returning strings. But most of the time, when you're thinking about web pages, you're going to be wanting to return HTML files. So, of course, we can do that here in Flask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into this Flask folder. I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it templates. And then inside of templates, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it home.html. Now inside of here, I'm just going to create, say, an HTML5 starter document. I'm not going to worry about any of the specifications. And then inside the body, I'll just put a hello world h1 tag. Now, come here. I'm going to remove all of this that we've done, except for we still want to respond to this home root here. And I'm just call it, actually, I'll call this home now, just to make things a little more clear. Now, instead of returning hello world like we were before, what I want to do is I actually want to return the HTML that's contained inside of this templates folder. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to call a function that's provided by Flask, and it's called render template, and it's home.html. So this is going to go look inside of this templates folder, and it's going to return the file that you've provided it here. Now actually, if I were to run this, I'm going to get an error, and the reason is that render template needs to be imported from Flask here. So I'll just add import Flask, render template. Now when I refresh, you see that we get this HTML page that's being generated. You know, if I came in and I said, how are you? And an H5 tag below it, you see we get that there. This is going well, but again, obviously it's pretty basic so far. So one thing that you can do when you render the template is you can provide some variables to the script. Again, let's say that you had a user profiling system and there was a username and the signed in user, you know, you were storing their username. So I'm going to hard code this, but you know, you can think about this as being a part of your application more broadly. But if I provide after the file that we want to render a named variable here, and then I come back into my template file and let's just say, you know, welcome. And I want to say welcome to the username that's provided. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 2 curly braces and 2 curly braces on the other side. And I'm going to type username here. And what this is going to do is this uses a templating language that's provided by Flask. And when you have 2 curly braces, that's going to give you just an echoing out of the variable that you provide here. So when I come back and I refresh, you can see welcome partially developed. Now, we can obviously sort of do more with this, but for now, just being able to echo out these variables should be enough to show you what I want to do here. So what I'm going to do is create what I'll call a math game. And the idea with it is that I want to be able to respond to a math question, and this math question, you know, it's just going to be a simple randomly generated math question. And so this is going to use a couple of the built-in functions of Flask, and so following along with this should hopefully give you a sense of some of what's capable. So I'm going to define the root math game, and I'm going to define the function to be math game, and for now we won't have it take any URL parameters. And my general thought with this is that I need to generate a couple of random numbers. So I'm going to just come up here and I'm going to import the random library. So if you're not familiar with the random library, this just lets you generate pseudo-random numbers inside of Python. Now from here, what I want to do is I want to say num1 equals random.randint, and I'll generate a random number between 0 and 100. And I'm actually going to want 2 of those. So I'll run that twice, num1 and num2. And now, just to get things started here, what we're going to do is we're going to render a template, and we'll call it math.html. And to this template, I'm going to provide num1 equals num1, and num2 equals num2. Now, obviously, I need to go into my templates, create it. So we'll call that math.html. Start in HTML5. Again, don't really care about any of this right now. We'll do the math game. We just want to get things working. We'll say math game. And now, just to start, we're going to assume that it only takes addition. So I go, what is, and again, we're going to enter num1 plus num2. Question mark. So when I refresh, you can see, obviously we don't get it here, but if I go to the root math game, you can see what is 47 plus 24, and if I refresh, 82 plus 73, 85 plus 100, the list goes on. With that, now we obviously want to provide the ability for the individual to answer this question, and then us to respond to this answer. So what we're going to do here is we're going to get an HTML form. And if you're not familiar with HTML forms, this is basically going to allow you to have some user input. So we specify the action, which is basically what is the URL that we want the server to respond to this at. So I'm going to specify math game, which is actually the current URL that we're on. And we're going to specify the method to be post. So if you're not familiar with the different types of HTTP requests, then you can check out my video that I'll be making on that. But for now, just know that there are 2 major types of requests. There's GET requests and POST requests, and we want this form to submit to a POST request. Now we need to have an input, which is text, and we'll give it the name of answer. We also are going to want an input, which is going to be of type hidden. And we want the name here to be the correct answer. And the reason that we're going to do this is so that we can just store whatever the answer to the question should be right away. And then we don't have to worry about trying to pass back in the numbers that we've provided here. Now finally, we want an input type of submit. And the value here is going to be check answer. And we'll save that. Come back in here, refresh, and you can see we get this box. And we get this check answer. And if we enter in things and click check answer, you can see that we get this method not allowed error page. So it's a 4 or 5 error. So what's that all about? Well, by default, routes that you create in Flask are only going to allow you to send GET requests to them. So in order to allow a URL to have post requests sent to it, into this app.route function here, we need to specify the methods, which are going to be GET. And in this case, we also want to allow post requests. So we can come back here, refresh, you can see that request sent. Now it hasn't done anything because we didn't write any code to do anything, but now we're not getting any errors when we send that. So next thing that we're going to want to do is actually handle that request. So the way we do that is we need another piece of the Flask library here, and we're going to just pull in requests. Down inside of our math game, I'm going to write some code here to determine whether the request is a GET or a POST request. So the way that we do that is simply through the request.method. So request method is going to either equal GET or it's going to equal POST, depending on whether you have a GET or a POST request. So what I will write here is if request method is equal to POST, then in here, I'm just going to pass it for now. But what I want to do is handle the incorrect answer. Okay. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to, in addition to num1 and num2, I'm going to create a correct answer. And for now, again, I'll just have this as num1 plus num2. And I'm going to specify that the correct answer equals correct answer. We'll go into the math here, and what I want to do is specify the value for this hidden variable to be the correct answer. So we'll go back into this math game, just refresh the page like this, and I'm going to go into this inspect element here, and you can see that the correct answer field now has the value of the correct answer stored in it, right? So 84 plus 90 is 174. If I refresh here, you can see it's now 120. So this is being stored correctly. To show you what happens when we get a request back, I'm going to import one other function here, and that's the function called JSONify. Basically, JSONify is going to take a Python dictionary and return it as a string that you can see in your browser. Specifically, it's going to be a JSON string if you know what that is. If not, don't worry too much about the details here. But basically what I want to do is I'm going to return the JSONify, and I'm going to say request.form. So this request.form is going to contain all of the information from the form that's been submitted, assuming that some form has been submitted. So if I go back into the game here, if I just refresh this, nothing happens. And the reason that nothing is happening is because the request method was GET, not POST. So I bring this back up. What is 1 plus 26? We'll say 27. Check answer. And now you can see that we get this string. So we'll have a key with answer. The answer I provided was 27. And then we have a key with correct answer. The answer that is correct is 27. We're going to first check to make sure that answer is in request.form and correct answer in request.form. Now the reason that we're doing this is just so that we don't try and access these elements when they're not there. Then what we want to do is we're going to say if request.form answer equals request.form correct answer, then here the answer is correct, else the answer is incorrect. So what I'd really like to be able to do is just flash a message to the top of the user's screen when we reload the page that lets them know whether their answer was correct or not. But for now, just to show you that this is working, at least it's working to some degree, we'll just return a string that says correct, or it says incorrect. So if we just go back and actually run this code now, then you can see, refreshing, we get correct. If I come back here and, I enter in the incorrect answer, you see we get incorrect. Now, like I said, I'd prefer it if a message would flash up here to the user. Now, lucky for us, this functionality is actually built in to Flask. So what we're going to want to do to bring this in is import one final thing, and that's going to be flash. So this is going to let us flash an answer, or flash this message to the user. Now, in order to do that, we'll need to create a session with Flask, and in order to do this, we need to provide it with a secret key. So all of this will be covered in more detail later on, but for now, all I want you to do is say app.secretKey, and then create a B string, which just is, some text here. In reality, you want this to be secret and you want this to be randomly generated, but for now, it does not much matter because this isn't going to be sort of a real application. And so what we'll do is we'll come down to where we're currently returning correct or incorrect. And what I want to do is I'm going to type flash correct, and I'm going to type flash incorrect. So what this should do is this should flash a message to the user. Now we're going to have to handle this user inside of our template. And so the way that we're actually going to be doing this is through a get flashed messages function. So if I come up to the top here, in addition to the echoing with these two curly braces, there's some basic functionality, programming functionality, that's provided if you type curly brace and then the percentage symbol. And then, of course, you close it with another one. So, for instance, we can use conditional statements. And I can say if get flashed messages. So this get flashed messages function here is going to grab anything that we called flash on in our code. And if any of them exist, then this conditional will run. Now when I come down to the bottom here, I need to type end if to sort of specify that this if block ends with this if block. Now, like if statements, we can also run sort of basic loops here. So I can say for message in get flashed messages. This is obviously going to grab every single message, and then we'll be able to output something here for each of those messages. And I'm going to just type N4 down at the bottom here. Now, all I'm going to want to do for this, I'm going to take a div, and I'm just going to give it some basic styling. So I'll say margin 50 pixels auto. We'll give it a width of 85%, and we'll say that it has a border of 2 pixels solid black. Then inside of here, we just want to echo out this message variable, which is coming from here. So now, with this, we should actually be ready to just be flashing the messages back to the user. So if I come here and I say check answer, I've entered 123, the answer is actually 100, so I should check answer and see we get incorrect. Now, this is obviously going to be working, and if I type 89 here, you can check the answer, you can see that we get correct. For sake of my eyes, I'm just going to throw some padding, 25 pixels onto that. And then we're going to come back here, and we're just going to tidy this up a little bit. So if the answer that they provided was incorrect, then we'll want to actually let them know what the correct answer was. So I'm going to make this incorrect message an F string here, and I'm going to type the correct answer was, and then inside of a single set of curlies here, we'll say request.form correct answer, save that. Then we'll open this up. We'll try this out. Resubmit. Correct answer was 118. The correct answer was 114. If you enter in the correct answer, you just get the correct message there. There's obviously a lot more that Flask can do. This is only really just scratching the surface, but I think it makes sense to play around with the routing, to play around with the request objects, to play around with sending parameters over to templates and then creating templates. And by playing around with this, you just get a sense of what you're doing. Once I actually start the full tutorial on how to use Flask to make a full-fledged application, we'll obviously be diving into a lot of this in greatly more detail, but this just gives you a sense of the types of things that you can start doing with a Flask application right off the bat, and hopefully gives you some ideas for what you might be able to do in your own applications.